Montana Territory, 1876. The harsh winter had finally broken, and the first shoots of green were pushing through the thawing earth at the Triple C Ranch. Xavier Calloway stood on the porch of his newly constructed ranch house, surveying the land he'd worked 3 years to claim. At 24, he'd accomplished what many men twice his age never would: 500 acres of prime grazing land, a growing herd of cattle, and a sturdy home built by his own hands. Yet as he watched his ranch hands break for their midday meal, eating jerky and hardtack in the shadow of the bunkhouse, a familiar emptiness gnawed at him. The ranch was thriving, but the house behind him stood mostly empty, its rooms echoing with silence. Xavier had long convinced himself that this was how it had to be. A man couldn't build something worth having out here and risk his heart too. The frontier demanded everything. There wasn't room for softness or sentiment. Everyone he'd ever loved had been taken by this wild country. His mother to fever, his father to a rustler's bullet. The lesson was clear. Attachment was weakness, and weakness got you killed in Montana. "You need a cook, boss," said Hank, his foreman, approaching with his hat in hand. "Men are getting tired of their own cooking, and you're working too hard to do it yourself." Xavier ran a hand through his sandy hair, knowing Hank was right. "I'll put up a notice in town. But I want someone who won't bring complications. Just someone to cook, nothing more." Hank nodded, though his eyes carried a knowing look that Xavier chose to ignore. As he mounted his horse and rode toward Helena, Xavier told himself that this was purely practical. The ranch needed a cook. Nothing would change. He'd learned long ago that the only thing that mattered was building something that would last, something no one could take away. 2 days later, Xavier tacked the notice to the town board at precisely noon. Ranch cook needed. Room and board provided. Good wages for capable worker. Apply at Triple C Ranch. He'd been deliberate in his wording. Nothing to suggest he wanted anything but a cook. He had just turned to leave when a soft voice stopped him. "Excuse me, sir. Is this your notice?" Xavier turned and found himself face to face with a young woman whose deep blue eyes caught him entirely off guard. She couldn't have been more than 22, with honey blonde hair pulled back beneath a modest bonnet. Her dress was simple but well kept, the dark blue fabric setting off her fair complexion. What struck Xavier most, though, was the quiet dignity in her posture, despite the visible exhaustion in her eyes. "It is," he managed, suddenly aware that he was staring. "I'm Rebecca Northcott," she said. "I'm inquiring about the position." Before Xavier could respond, a small voice called, "Mama," and a little girl of about 4 appeared at Rebecca's side, clutching a worn rag doll. Behind her trailed a boy who looked to be 6, with the same blonde hair as his mother. Rebecca's cheeks flushed slightly. "These are my children, Emma and Thomas." She straightened her shoulders. "I should mention that I'm a widow. My husband passed at Antietam." Xavier felt his carefully constructed plans crumbling. A widow with children? This was exactly the sort of complication he'd wanted to avoid. Yet something in the determined set of her jaw stopped him from dismissing her outright. "Can you cook, Mrs. Northcott?" he asked, more gruffly than he'd intended. A flash of pride crossed her features. "I ran a boarding house back east for 3 years after my husband died. I can feed 20 men 3 meals a day without breaking stride." Xavier hesitated, his mind racing. Everything in him said to walk away, to find a grizzled old ranch cook who wouldn't disrupt the careful isolation he'd built. Yet he found himself saying, "The job includes quarters in the main house. It would be just you and the children there, besides myself." "I understand," she replied. "We won't be a bother, Mr. Calloway." "Xavier Calloway." "Mr. Calloway, I can promise you 3 things: good food, hard work, and discretion. What I ask in return is respect and safety for my children." Xavier studied her face, seeing the desperation she was working so hard to hide. Something about her quiet strength tugged at him in ways he didn't want to examine. "The Triple C Ranch is 8 miles north of town. You can come tomorrow if you want to see the place before deciding." Relief washed over her features. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway. We'll be there." As Xavier mounted his horse and headed home, a sense of unease settled over him. He'd just invited a woman and 2 children into his carefully ordered world. It was just for cooking, he told himself firmly. Nothing would change. The frontier was no place for families or attachments. He'd learned that lesson in blood. But as he glanced back at Rebecca Northcott and her children standing in the dusty street, A treacherous thought whispered through his mind. What if he was wrong? The next morning, Xavier found himself pacing the porch, watching the road for signs of visitors. He'd spent half the night preparing the unused bedroom and small adjoining room, telling himself it was just good business to be prepared. When he finally spotted the approaching wagon, his heart hammered traitorously against his ribs. Rebecca drove competently, her children beside her on the seat. When she pulled up to the hitching post, Xavier noticed how few possessions they had, just 2 trunks and a few bundles. The reality of her situation struck him anew. This woman was desperate, yet she carried herself with quiet dignity. "Your ranch is beautiful, Mr. Calloway," she said after he'd helped her down. "Built it from nothing," he replied, unexpectedly pleased by her observation. 3 years of work. Rebecca nodded appreciatively. That's something to be proud of. As Xavier showed her the house and kitchen, he watched her assessing everything with a practical eye. She asked intelligent questions about supplies, schedules, and the men's preferences. The children stayed close to their mother, the boy protective, the little girl shy but curious. "The men eat in the bunkhouse," Xavier explained. "I take my meals here in the house." He hesitated. "You and the children would join me, I suppose." Something flashed in Rebecca's eyes. Wariness, perhaps. "Is that appropriate, Mr. Calloway?" The question caught him off guard. "I'm offering you a job, Mrs. Northcott. Nothing more." She nodded, but Xavier couldn't help noticing the relief in her expression. She'd been worried about his intentions. The realization bothered him more than it should have. "I'll need to know what you expect," she said, moving on briskly. 3 meals daily for how many men?" 8 hands, plus myself. More during roundup. "And my wages?" Xavier named a figure, and Rebecca considered it carefully before nodding. "When would you want me to start?" "Tomorrow." The word came out before Xavier could stop it. A small smile touched her lips. "We can be ready tomorrow." As they stood in the kitchen finalizing the details, little Emma tugged at her mother's skirt. "Mama, can I have a flower garden here?" she whispered, but not quietly enough. Rebecca hushed her daughter with gentle embarrassment. "Emma, this isn't our home. We're here to work." Xavier felt something twist inside him at the child's hopeful face. "There's a patch behind the house that gets good morning sun," he found himself saying. "Wouldn't mind seeing something growing there besides weeds." The smile that bloomed on Emma's face hit Xavier with unexpected force. He turned away quickly, muttering about getting back to work. As he strode toward the barn, he silently berated himself. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. The last thing he needed was to get attached to a widow and her children who would likely move on when something better came along. Everyone left eventually, by choice or by death. That was the harsh truth of the frontier. Xavier had built his life around that knowledge, and he wasn't about to forget it now. The next day, Rebecca and her children arrived with their meager belongings, and the rhythm of life at the Triple C Ranch shifted. Xavier had expected disruption, but what he hadn't counted on was the immediate improvement. The bunkhouse mood lightened as the men enjoyed real meals again. The ranch house, which had been little more than a place to sleep, gradually transformed. Curtains appeared at the windows. The persistent layer of dust vanished. And most surprising of all, delicious aromas began to fill the rooms at regular intervals. Xavier tried to maintain his distance, eating quickly and escaping to work. But as days stretched into weeks, he found it increasingly difficult. Rebecca was unfailingly professional, yet there was a quiet warmth to her that drew him in despite his resistance. She never pried into his past, but she listened attentively when he spoke about the ranch. Her practical suggestions often revealed a sharp mind that surprised and impressed him. The children, too, began to carve out their place. Thomas trailed after the ranch hands whenever his mother allowed, absorbing everything about horses and cattle with boyish enthusiasm. Emma planted her garden with fierce determination, checking her seedlings each morning before helping her mother. One evening, about a month after their arrival, Xavier returned from a long day of mending fences to find Emma sitting on the porch steps, tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, awkwardly stopping before her. "The rabbits ate my flowers," she sobbed, pointing to her trampled garden. Xavier looked at the devastation, then back at the heartbroken child. Without thinking, he knelt down. "Tell you what. Tomorrow, we'll build a fence around your garden. A rabbit-proof one." Emma looked up, hope dawning on her tear-streaked face. Really, really, he found himself smiling back at her. The next day, Xavier showed Thomas how to measure and cut wood for the small fence, letting the boy hammer in some of the nails himself. Emma watched with serious attention, her earlier tears forgotten. When they finished, she threw her arms around Xavier's waist in an impulsive hug that left him frozen in surprise. From the kitchen doorway, Rebecca watched, her eyes filled with an emotion Xavier couldn't quite name. When their gazes met, something passed between them, a moment of connection that left him unsettled for days afterward. That night, he lay awake, troubled by how easily they were slipping under his defenses. He'd meant to keep them at arm's length, yet here he was, building garden fences and looking forward to mealtimes. This wasn't part of the plan. The frontier had taught him that survival meant standing alone, hadn't it? As spring bloomed fully into summer, life at the Triple C settled into a rhythm that began to feel dangerously like home. Rebecca's cooking became legendary among the ranch hands, and Xavier found himself lingering longer at meals, drawn into conversation with her and the children. One evening, as a thunderstorm rattled the windows, Xavier discovered Thomas huddled in the corner of the main room, wide-eyed with fear at each crash of thunder. "Your mama know you're out here?" Xavier asked quietly. Thomas shook his head. "Don't want her to think I'm a baby." Xavier sat down beside him. "Want to know something? Thunder scared me too when I was your age." "Really?" Thomas looked up skeptically. "But you're not scared of anything." Xavier almost corrected him, but stopped himself. The truth was more complicated. Everyone's scared of something, Thomas. Brave men just do what needs doing anyway. When the next thunderclap shook the house, Thomas flinched but stayed put. "Like my pa at Antietam?" The question caught Xavier off guard. "Your mother told you about that?" Thomas nodded solemnly. "She says he was very brave, but I don't remember him." Something ached in Xavier's chest. "I'm sure he was brave, and he'd be mighty proud of how you're looking after your mother and sister." They sat in companionable silence until the storm began to subside. When Rebecca found them there, Thomas drowsing against Xavier's shoulder, her face softened in a way that made Xavier's heart constrict. "Thank you," she said softly, as Thomas sleepily made his way back to bed. "It was nothing," Xavier replied, suddenly uncomfortable. Rebecca sat in the chair opposite him, the lamplight gilding her hair. "It wasn't nothing to him." She hesitated. "Or to me." Xavier found himself unable to look away from her face. "You've done well with them. They're good children." "They are." Pride and love filled her voice. "But it's been hard for them, not having a father." "You seem to manage fine on your own," Xavier said, though the words felt hollow even to his ears. Rebecca studied him thoughtfully. "Is that what you believe, Mr. Calloway? That it's better to manage alone?" The directness of her question startled him. "The frontier doesn't leave much room for anything else, doesn't it?" Her voice was soft but challenging. "I've found it's precisely the harshness of this place that makes connections so vital. No one survives alone, not really." Xavier felt as though she could see straight through the walls he'd built. "Some things aren't worth the risk," he said finally. "And some things are." Rebecca rose and moved toward the hallway, then paused. "The storm's passed. You should get some rest." Long after she'd gone, Xavier sat in the darkened room, her words echoing in his mind. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to question the belief that had guided his life since his parents' deaths, that love and attachment were weaknesses he couldn't afford. What if he was wrong? July brought Roundup, and with it, the busiest time of the year. The ranch hands worked from dawn until dusk, and Rebecca rose before the sun to feed everyone. Xavier found himself constantly aware of her, the grace with which she managed her increased workload, the way she still found time to listen to Emma's stories or help Thomas with his reading lessons in the evening. One sweltering afternoon, Xavier returned to the house for a forgotten ledger and found Rebecca in the kitchen, working dough with vigorous movements. Her sleeves were rolled up, flour dusted her forearms, and a strand of honey-blonde hair had escaped her usually neat bun. She looked up, startled by his entrance, and Xavier was struck by how beautiful she was, flushed from the heat, tired but determined. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, suddenly awkward. "It's your house," she reminded him with a small smile. "Are the men managing all right in this heat?" "They're complaining less since they have your cooking to look forward to." Rebecca laughed, a sound that had become more frequent in recent weeks. Flattery won't get you an extra piece of pie, Mr. Calloway. Xavier, he corrected her, surprising himself. After all this time, I think you could call me Xavier. Something shifted in her expression. Then I suppose I'm Rebecca. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Xavier found himself stepping closer, drawn by some force he couldn't name. The sound of hoofbeats outside broke the spell. One of the ranch hands was galloping toward the house, urgency in every line of his posture. "Boss," he called. "Rustlers hit the north pasture. They've taken 30 head at least, and Sam's been shot." The warm kitchen and Rebecca's presence vanished from Xavier's mind as he raced for his horse. For the next 12 hours, he and his men tracked the rustlers, recovered most of the stolen cattle, and brought Sam back to the ranch with a bullet through his shoulder. Rebecca met them at the door, immediately taking charge of the injured man. Xavier watched in amazement as she efficiently cleaned and bandaged the wound, her movements sure and steady despite the blood. "You've done this before," he observed as she finished. Rebecca nodded grimly. "The boarding house was near an army hospital. I volunteered there sometimes." She glanced at Sam's pale face. "He'll need watching tonight. Fever's the danger now." "I'll sit with him," Xavier offered. "We'll take turns," she countered, in a tone that brooked no argument. Through the long night, they alternated at Sam's bedside. In the quiet hours before dawn, as they changed places, Rebecca handed Xavier a cup of coffee, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you," he said, meaning far more than the coffee. "We take care of our own," she replied simply. The words lingered in Xavier's mind as he watched her walk away. Our own. When had the Triple C become hers too? And when had he started wanting it to be? As July melted into August, Xavier found himself increasingly drawn to Rebecca's quiet strength and intelligence. Their conversations grew longer, more personal. He learned about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her brief happiness with her husband before the war, the struggles she'd faced afterward. In turn, he gradually shared pieces of his own past, his parents' deaths, his determination to build something lasting, the loneliness he'd never admitted to anyone. One warm evening, as they sat on the porch after the children had gone to bed, Rebecca asked the question he'd been dreading. "Why did you really hire us, Xavier? A widow with 2 children must have seemed a complication you didn't need." Xavier considered deflecting, but the honesty between them deserved better. "It was, or I thought it was." He looked out at the darkening land. "I told myself the frontier was no place for attachments, that caring for people only made you vulnerable. And now," her voice was soft, "now I'm not so sure." He turned to face her. "You've changed things, Rebecca. You and the children." The admission hung between them, fraught with implications neither was ready to voice. Rebecca's eyes reflected the same mixture of hope and uncertainty Xavier felt. "We should probably turn in," she said finally. "Early start tomorrow." Xavier nodded, understanding her caution. As they rose, their hands brushed again, and this time, he deliberately caught her fingers with his own. For a breathless moment, they stood connected, until Rebecca gently withdrew her hand. "Good night, Xavier," she whispered, and disappeared inside. Xavier remained on the porch long after she'd gone, his certainties crumbling around him. The belief that had guided him for years, that love was a weakness on the frontier, was being challenged daily by Rebecca's presence, by the way she faced hardship with grace and courage, by the home she was creating within his walls. What if attachment wasn't weakness but strength? What if the real risk was in refusing to open his heart at all? The tension between them grew over the following weeks, a current of unspoken feelings that both attracted and frightened Xavier. He found reasons to be near her, yet held back from crossing the invisible line they'd drawn. Rebecca, too, seemed caught in the same dance of approach and retreat, her eyes sometimes lingering on him when she thought he wasn't looking. The children, however, had no such reservations. They'd fully embraced Xavier as part of their lives, running to meet him when he returned from the range, sharing their small triumphs and concerns. He found himself looking forward to their chatter at meals, to helping Thomas learn to whittle, to admiring Emma's growing garden. It was Emma who unwittingly brought matters to a head. At dinner one evening, she announced with a child's directness, "Jimmy Watson says we're not a real family because we don't have a papa." The table fell silent. Rebecca's cheeks flushed. "Emma, that's not appropriate dinner conversation." "But I told him we have Xavier, Emma persisted. That's almost like having a papa, isn't it? Xavier felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. Rebecca wouldn't meet his eyes. Emma, she said firmly, Mr. Calloway is our employer. He's been very kind to us, but that's all. The words cut deeper than Xavier expected. Was that truly all he was to them? An employer who'd shown kindness? May I be excused? He asked, pushing back from the table. Outside in the gathering dusk, Xavier tried to collect his thoughts. Emma's innocent question had forced him to confront what he'd been avoiding for weeks. He cared for Rebecca and her children, cared for them in ways that went far beyond employer and employee. But was he ready to become the father Emma imagined? Could he risk opening himself to that kind of loss again? His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a rider, Hank, returning from town with the mail and an expression of concern. "Boss, you're going to want to see this," he said, handing over a telegram. Xavier scanned the message, his blood running cold. From Sheriff J. Miller, Helena, to X. Calloway, Triple C Ranch. Information received that Jacob Pearson, seeking Rebecca Northcott, claims to be brother-in-law with legal claim on children. Advise Mrs. Northcott, Pearson, known troublemaker. Approach with caution. When did this come in? Xavier demanded. Just today? Sheriff said this Pearson fellow's been asking all over town about a widow with 2 blonde children. Said he heard she might be working at a ranch outside town. Xavier's mind raced. Find out everything you can about him, discreetly, and post an extra man on night watch. After Hank left, Xavier stood frozen, the telegram crumpled in his fist. Rebecca had never mentioned a brother-in-law, but the threat in the sheriff's warning was clear enough. Someone was looking for Rebecca and her children, someone the sheriff considered dangerous. When Xavier returned to the house, he found Rebecca at the sink, her back to the door. The children had already gone to bed. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "we need to talk." She turned, her expression guarded until she saw his face. "What's happened?" He handed her the telegram without preamble. Her face drained of color as she read it. "Jacob," she whispered. "How did he find us? You know him then?" Rebecca sank into a chair, the paper trembling in her hands. "He's my late husband's brother. A cruel, greedy man." Her voice hardened. "After William died, Jacob tried to take the children. Said a woman couldn't raise them properly. But what he really wanted was William's pension and the children's inheritance." "Why would he have any claim?" Xavier asked, sitting across from her. "He doesn't. But he's persuasive and vindictive. Back east, he turned people against me, spread terrible rumors." Her eyes met Xavier's, filled with a fear he'd never seen there before. "I left in the night with the children. Changed our name from Nelson to Northcott, my mother's maiden name. We've been moving west ever since, staying ahead of him." The pieces fell into place in Xavier's mind. Her wariness, her desperate need for employment, the way she'd guarded her past. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. "Because I was afraid you wouldn't hire us if you knew we might bring trouble." Her voice broke. "And later, I was afraid you'd ask us to leave." The admission cut through Xavier's remaining defenses. In that moment, he realized with crystal clarity that he couldn't bear the thought of them leaving. Not now, not ever. "Listen to me," he said, reaching across the table to take her hands. "No one is going to take your children. Not while I have breath in my body." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "You don't know Jacob. He's dangerous, Xavier. And he won't stop until he gets what he wants. Then he'll find more than he bargained for at the Triple C." Xavier's voice was steel. "This is your home now. All of you. And I protect what's mine." The word hung between them. Mine, with all its implications. Rebecca's gaze searched his face. "Why would you do this? Risk yourself and your ranch for us?" Xavier took a deep breath, finally ready to speak the truth he'd been avoiding for months. "Because I love you, Rebecca. You and the children. You've shown me that what I thought was strength, standing alone, was really just fear. Real strength is having the courage to love, even knowing what it might cost." Rebecca's hands tightened on his. "I've been so afraid to hope," she whispered. "Afraid to believe we could have a real home again. That I could trust my heart to someone after losing William." "I'm not asking you to forget him," Xavier said gently. "But I am asking for a chance to build something with you. Something that will last." For answer, Rebecca rose and came around the table. When Xavier stood to meet her, she stepped into his arms as naturally as if she'd always belonged there. "I love you too," she said against his chest. I think I have since that day you built Emma's garden fence. Xavier tilted her face up to his. I'll build her 100 fences if it means you'll stay. Their first kiss was tentative, then deepening with the certainty of feelings too long denied. When they finally drew apart, Xavier knew with absolute clarity that he would do anything to protect this woman and her children. We'll face Pearson together, he promised. But first thing tomorrow, I'm riding into town to speak with the sheriff. And to get a marriage license, if you'll have me. Rebecca's answering smile was radiant. Yes, she said simply. With all my heart, yes. The next morning, Xavier rode to Helena with a lighter heart than he'd had in years, despite the threat looming over them. His meeting with Sheriff Miller confirmed his worst fears. Jacob Pearson had arrived in town 2 days earlier, asking questions about Rebecca and making veiled threats. He's staying at the Golden Eagle, the sheriff told Xavier. Been drinking heavily and running his mouth. Says he's got papers giving him guardianship of the children. Are they legitimate? Xavier asked. The sheriff shrugged. Hard to say without seeing them. But a judge might be persuaded, especially if the lady in question has been using a different name. Xavier left the sheriff's office with a marriage license in his pocket and a grim determination in his heart. On the way out of town, he stopped at the church to speak with the minister, making arrangements for the following Sunday. As he approached the Triple C, Xavier spotted an unfamiliar horse tied at the hitching post. Cold dread washed over him. Urging his mount to a gallop, he raced the last half-mile to the ranch house. He burst through the door to find a tall, hard-faced man standing in his front room. Rebecca stood across from him, the children behind her, her face white but determined. You must be Calloway, the man said, his voice slick with false amiability. I'm Jacob Pearson, Rebecca's brother-in-law. We were just discussing family matters. Xavier moved to Rebecca's side, his hand settling protectively on her shoulder. There's nothing to discuss, Pearson. Rebecca and the children are staying here. Pearson's friendly facade slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. These children are my brother's blood. I have papers giving me guardianship. He pulled a folded document from his coat. The law's on my side. A woman using a false name, running from town to town, doesn't look good, does it? Those papers are forged, Rebecca said, her voice steady despite her fear. And you have no interest in the children beyond their inheritance. Pearson's eyes narrowed. Be careful, Rebecca. You're in no position to make accusations. But I am, Xavier interrupted. Sheriff Miller's been watching you, Pearson. He knows exactly why you're here. The law will still side with family, Pearson sneered. What are you to them? Just some rancher who took in a desperate widow. How would it look if people knew you were living under the same roof? Hardly proper, is it? That's why I'm marrying her on Sunday, Xavier replied evenly. With the full blessing of Reverend Collins and half the county as witnesses. Pearson's confidence faltered momentarily before his face hardened. It won't matter. I'll contest it. I'll drag her name through the mud so thoroughly no judge will side with her. Xavier stepped forward, his voice dangerously quiet. You'll do no such thing. You're going to leave this ranch now, and you're not coming back. Ever. Or what? Pearson challenged, his hand moving toward his coat. The click of a rifle being cocked froze him in place. Hank stood in the doorway, weapon aimed steadily at Pearson's chest. Boss? Hank asked calmly. Mr. Pearson was just leaving, Xavier said. And he's going to take the evening stage out of Helena. Aren't you, Pearson? Pearson's eyes darted between the rifle and Xavier's implacable expression. This isn't over, he spat. It is, Xavier countered. Because if you ever come near my family again, it won't be the sheriff you'll answer to. It'll be me and every man who works this ranch. We protect our own out here. When Pearson had been escorted off the property, Rebecca collapsed into Xavier's arms, the children clinging to them both. Is he really gone? Thomas asked, his young face fierce with protective anger. Xavier knelt to the boy's level. He's gone, and he won't be back. I promise you that. Emma tugged at his sleeve. Did you mean it? About marrying Mama? Xavier looked up at Rebecca, whose eyes shone with a mixture of tears and hope. I meant every word. That is, if your mother still wants to marry a stubborn rancher who took too long to realize what was right in front of him. Rebecca laughed through her tears. I do. More than anything. That Sunday, with wildflowers from Emma's garden decorating the small church and Thomas standing proudly as the ring bearer, Xavier and Rebecca exchanged vows before the entire community. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed his bride with all the love that had grown in his heart over the past months. The celebration afterward at the Triple C Ranch was the happiest the property had ever seen. As twilight fell, Xavier found a moment alone with Rebecca on the porch of what was now truly their home. "Happy?" he asked, drawing her close. "Completely," she answered, leaning into his embrace. "Though I still can't quite believe it's real." "Believe it," Xavier said, kissing her forehead. "This is just the beginning." From inside came the sound of children's laughter and the warm buzz of conversation as their friends and neighbors celebrated with them. The ranch house, once so empty, now overflowed with life and love. Xavier thought of the lonely man he'd been when he first posted that notice for a ranch cook. How could he have known that a single widow with children would answer it and change everything? "What are you thinking?" Rebecca asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "I'm thinking about how wrong I was," he replied honestly. "I believed the frontier was no place for love, that caring for people made you vulnerable." Rebecca's eyes softened. "And now I know that love isn't weakness. It's the only real strength there is." Xavier looked out at his ranch, at the home they would build together. The frontier isn't about surviving alone. It's about finding people worth fighting for, worth living for. "Worth loving," Rebecca added softly. "Worth everything," Xavier agreed, and drew his wife close as the stars began to appear above their home.